as a real estate investor, how to manage and protect your rental properties. For example, I have 10 real estate properties, right? Those are rentals. Those are separate from my primary home. So you have 10 rental properties. So your goal here is to separate each rental property from the other one. So this is where you're trying to reach. And there's a couple of solutions how to solve that problem, right?
So let's say that you have, like we said, 5 or 10 properties, and you want to be able to protect each one of those properties individually. And so what we're saying here is you're splitting the liability for each property onto itself. So if something were to happen at property 1 out of your 10 different properties, that if there were to be a judgment dealing with property 1, that it wouldn't have the possibility of reaching out and affecting properties 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc.
The judgment is $2 million, and then the $2 million against the rental property 1. Rental property 1 is worth $1 million. So you only need to sell that one and pay for the judgment, right? You don't need to sell the rest of the 9 rental properties.
Correct. So in a matter like that, if you were to have a judgment against one single property that you own, it doesn't allow any judgment. So as we just said, if the judgment is for $2 million, property is only worth $1 million. You would sell that property, liquidate the property, and pay the $1 million. Even though you own multiple other properties, which could be worth up to $1 million, the liability stays with property 1. You wouldn't have to sell properties 2, 3, 4, et cetera, to be able to pay the rest of the judgment.
That's a great deal. Everybody should have that.
So it's actually really smart. So obviously, we think that the best possibility for a real estate investor is to create that limited liability company that we've already talked about. But let's talk about how we can divide the properties in this way that we've just discussed. So depending on the state that you live in, there's 2 different ways to do this. So within the limited liability company setup, depending on what state you're in, there is the C Corp, which is the standard limited liability company. And then there's also an S Corp. So an S Corp stands for series. And so what that does is it allows you to subdivide within the limited liability company to have those individual subdivisions of the LLC. Here it works really well for a real estate investor because you can take your limited liability company and you can subdivide it so that you have the different properties represented as different subdivisions within your LLC. And so it does exactly what we've just discussed, where we keep the different properties separate so that if there is to be a judgment or there's anything that happens with the first property, it doesn't affect the properties 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. So that anything that you would have that would be a liability issue for property number 1 stays with property number 1. And doesn't affect your other properties.
2 solutions. One is to have multiple LLCs. Like for example, you have 10 rental properties, you have to form 10 separate LLCs for each.
Correct. So if you live in one of the states that doesn't recognize a series LLC, like we just spoke about, your only other option is you can create an individual LLC for each one of the properties. So if you own 10 properties, you'd have to make 10 separate LLCs. Typically, if you live in a state where you can have a series LLC, it's the more smart and savvy solution. And let me kind of explain why. If you have to create individual LLCs for each one of the properties, because you live in a state that doesn't recognize a series LLC, such as California or Georgia, for example, you have to create an individual LLC for each one of your properties. When you do that, you're having to file articles of incorporation and actually create the LLC for each one of the individual properties. You can have 10 different sets of articles of formation, bylaws. You'd have to pay for a registered agent for each one of those, or name yourself as the registered agent. You'd also have to keep 10 different sets of books. You'd have to have 10 different bank accounts. So you'd have a different bank account, a different set of books, a different complete business for each one of those rental properties that you have. So if you do live in a state where the series LLC is recognized, it's highly preferable just because it's a more simplistic and a more elegant solution, because you only have to have one set of books, but you keep each individual property noted, and you only have to have one actual LLC.
So Series LLC is a special type of LLC, which is different from simple LLC. So when you incorporate Series LLC, you need to make sure that to include a special language that you want the Secretary of State to understand that this is a Series LLC, which is different. Under the Series LLC, it's like a big umbrella, and you can create a different subdivisions, like 10 subdivisions, to keep 10 rental properties separately. So it's a special type of formation, and definitely need experienced attorneys or experienced professionals to form that special type of LLC for you.
Yeah, so if you are going to create a Series LLC and you want that simpler and more elegant solution that we've been talking about, it's definitely in your best interest to have an attorney set it up, because there's specific language that you're going to need to have in your articles of formation. And it's a little more complicated for you to set up initially. However, as we've said, it makes the overall process of being able to have those subdivisions and being able to keep a more simplistic accounting of books and for your taxes and everything else, it makes everything a whole lot easier. So it is a simple and more elegant solution for anybody that is a real estate investor in a state that recognizes the Series LLC.